Today, people would suffer from certain doubts. They would suffer from certain doubts because they think that idealism, sincerity, dedication, purity of heart, purity of mind are qualities preferable to corruption, wickedness, calculation, egoism, mendacity, the desire to exploit other people for their own benefit, which these great state founders undoubtedly were guilty of. And therefore, we are in some sense children of both worlds. Our peculiar position is that we are heirs to Romanticism because Romanticism broke that great single mold in which humanity, in one way or another, had marched hitherto, the philosophia perennis. We are in some sense products of certain doubts. We can't quite tell. We give so many marks for consequence, so many marks for motive. And we oscillate between the two. If it goes too far, if someone is a Hitler, then we don't think that his sincerity is necessarily a saving quality, although in the 30s it was much argued in his favor. At the same time, he must go very far indeed and flout values which are of an extremely universal kind. So that in some sense we are still members of some kind of unified tradition. But the field within which we now oscillate freely, the amount of allowance we make is far, far greater than it has ever been before. And for this, the Romantic movement is to a great degree responsible, inasmuch as it preached the incompatibility of ideals, the importance of motive, the importance of character, or at any rate of so to speak, of purpose, over consequence, over efficiency, over effect, over happiness, success, and position in the world. When Hölderlin said, happiness is not an ideal, happiness is tepid water on the tongue. When Nietzsche said, man does not desire happiness, only the Englishman does. This was a sentiment which on the whole would not have been laughed at in the 17th or 18th centuries. At least, I think not. And I think this is perhaps the direct product of the Romantic movement. Now, as to existentialism. The central sermon of existentialism is essentially a romantic one, namely, that there is in the world nothing to lean on. If you try and explain your conduct and you say, c'est plus fort que moi, it's too strong for me, emotion overcame me, or there are certain principles of an objective kind which although I hate it, I must subserve, or I have received orders from an institution which is eternal or divine, or which is of an objectively valid character, and although I may not like it, it has given the order, it being laws of economics, it being the Ministry of the Interior, it being whatever it may be. It has given the orders, and it has a right to my validity. Once you begin doing this, you are simply using alibis. You are simply pretending that you are not deciding, when in fact you have decided, but don't care to face the consequences of the fact that it is you who have decided. Even when you say, I am partly unconscious, I am the product of unconscious forces, I cannot help it, I have a complex. It is not my fault, I am driven. It is because my father was unkind to my mother that I am today the monster that I am. This is, broadly speaking, and I think he's probably right about this, is broadly speaking an attempt to curry favor or to obtain sympathy by transferring the weight of responsibility for your acts, in which you are entirely free, to something objective. It doesn't matter whether it is a political organization or a psychological doctrine. But somewhere you are trying to shift responsibility from your shoulders because, of course, it is you who decide it. Once you say you are a monster and don't mind being a monster, evidently, it's a kind of complacent acceptance of something which you know to be evil, but of which you take the curse, off which you take a curse by saying, not I, society is responsible. We're all determined. We cannot help it. There is a causality which pervades the world, and I am merely the instrument of powerful forces which I can no more prevent from making me evil as it can prevent from making you good. You are not to be congratulated for being good, nor am I condemned for being evil. Neither of us can help our fate. We are simply fragments of an enormous causal process. Sartre, I think with a certain justice, echoes the views of Fichte, echoes the views of Kant, which is where it all comes from, ultimately, in saying that this is, in some sense, either self-deception or deliberate deception of others. And the existentialists, of course, go further than this. They say that the very notion of a metaphysical structure of the universe, theology or metaphysics, they attempt to say that certain things have essences, which merely means things are what they are of necessity. We arrive in a world which has a certain structure which cannot be altered. Physical structure, chemical structure, social structure, psychological structure, and metaphysical and theological structure, with God at the head of this great creation and the amoeba below, or whatever it is you may believe in. These are nothing but pathetic attempts on the part of human beings to make themselves at home in the world by breeding enormous cozy fantasies, so that the world shall be such that they shall be able to fit into it more comfortably and shall not have to face the appalling prospect of total responsibility for all their acts upon their own shoulders. And when they give motives for doing what they do, when they say, I've done this because of that, because in order to pursue this. And you say, but why should you pursue this particular end? And you say, because it is objectively right. That, too, for the existentialist, is again an attempt to transfer responsibility of what should be a free choice in a vacuum onto something which is not yours, which is objective. Natural law, the sayings of the sages, the pronouncements of sacred books, the pronouncements of scientists in the laboratory, what psychologists and sociologists say, what politicians or economists declare, not I, they. And this is regarded as, on the whole, an attempt to shuffle off responsibility and to blind oneself, and blind oneself unnecessarily, to the fact that the universe is in fact a kind of void. That is what is meant by calling it absurd. A kind of void in which you and you alone exist, and you make whatever there is to make, and you are responsible for making what you make, and you cannot plead extenuation. All excuses are false, and all explanations are explaining the way. And this might as well be faced by a man who is brave enough and tragic enough to face reality as he should. This is the Stoic sermon of existentialism, and it derives directly from Romanticism. Some Romantics, of course, went too far, by which I mean this. Let me give you the extraordinary example of Stirner, which I think may perhaps lead us to see what it is in the end that is valuable in Romanticism, even for us now. Stirner was a German Hegelian schoolmaster who argued quite correctly as follows. The Romantics are quite right in supposing that when we think that institutions are eternal, this is a mistake. Institutions are created freely by human beings for the benefit of other human beings, and in time become worn out. And therefore, by looking at them from the point of view of the present, we see they are worn out, we must abolish them and have new institutions freely arrived at by our own indomitable will. This is not merely true of political institutions, economic institutions, or other public institutions. It's equally true of doctrines. Doctrines can also be a most terrible weight upon us, fearful chains and tyrannies which yoke us down to all kinds of views which the present or our own wills no longer desiderate. But if it is true, and therefore theories too must be blown up. Any kind of general theory, say Hegel, say Marx, is itself a ghastly form of despotism, which claims to have some kind of objective validity beyond the choice of individual men. This cannot be right, for it confines us and cribs us and limits our free activity. But if this is true about doctrines, it will be equally true of all general propositions. But if it is true of all general propositions, then, and this is the last step of all, which some Romantics certainly took, it's true of all words. Because all words are general. They all classify. If I use the word yellow, I want to mean by it what I meant by it yesterday and what you will mean by it tomorrow. And this, of course, is a terrible yoke. This is a fearful despotism. Why should the word yellow mean the same thing now and tomorrow? Why can't I alter it? Why should twice two always make four? Why should words be uniform? Why can't I make up my own universe each time that I begin? But of course, if I do that, then if there is no systematic symbolism, I can't think. And if I can't think, I go mad. And to do him justice, Stirner did duly go mad. And ended his life very honorably and very consistently in a lunatic asylum, as a perfectly peaceful, harmless lunatic somewhere in the middle 60s. But something of the sort was also boiling in the mind of Nietzsche, who was a far superior thinker, but who in certain respects resembles Stirner. And from this, I think, a moral may be drawn, namely, that so long as we live in society, we communicate. Those with whom if we did not communicate, we should hardly be men. Among the definitions of what we mean by human being is someone who understands at any rate a portion of what we say to him. To this degree, then, there must be some degree of common values, common language, common communication, and some degree of common values. Otherwise, there will be no intelligibility between human beings. But a human being who cannot understand what any other human being says is scarcely a human being. He is on the whole pronounced abnormal. To the extent to which there is normality, there is communication, there are common values. To the extent to which there are common values, it is impossible to say everything must be created by me. If I find something given, smash it. If I find something structured, destroy it, in order to give free play to my unbridled imagination. And to this extent, Romanticism, if it's driven to its logical conclusion, does certainly end in some kind of lunacy. In a certain sense, fascism too is an inheritor of Romanticism, and that is inherited not because it is irrational, plenty of movements have been that, or because it believes in elites, plenty of movements have been that. The reason why fascism owes something to Romanticism is again because of this notion of the unpredictable will, either of a man or of a group, which forges forward in some impossible to organize, impossible to predict, impossible to rationalize fashion. That is the whole heart, so to speak, in a certain sense, of fascism. That is the whole heart. The whole heart of fascism was what the leader will say tomorrow, how the spirit will move us, where we shall go, what we shall do. That cannot be foretold. The hysterical element, the hysterical self-assertion, and the nihilistic destruction of existing institutions because they can find the unlimited will, which is the only thing which counts for human beings. The superior person who crushes the inferior because his will is stronger, that is a direct inheritance. In an extremely distorted and garbled form, no doubt, but still an inheritance from these romantics of whom I have been speaking. And this certainly has played an extremely powerful part in our lives. The whole thing, indeed, is an attempt to impose an aesthetic model upon reality, to say everything should obey the rules of art. If you are an artist, then perhaps some of these propositions which I've tried to utter during the last 6 lectures have a great deal of validity. The attempt to convert life into art presupposes that human beings are stuff. That presupposes they are simply, in some sense, material, even as paints or sounds are material. And to the degree to which this is not true, to the degree to which human beings, in order to communicate with each other, are forced to recognize certain common values, are forced to recognize certain common facts, are forced to live in a common world, to the extent to which not everything which science says is nonsense. Not everything which common sense declares is untrue. Because to say that is in itself a self-contradictory and absurd proposition. To this extent, Romanticism in its full form, and even its offshoots in the form of both existentialism and of fascism, seem to me to be fallacious. Let me end on one further note. What can be said we owe to Romanticism? Well, we owe a great deal to it. We owe the notion of the freedom of the artist, and the fact that neither he nor human beings in general can be explained by oversimplified views such as were prevalent in the 18th century and such as are still enunciated by over-rational and over-scientific analysts of either human beings or groups. I think we owe to Romanticism also the notion that a unified answer to human affairs is likely to be ruinous. That if human beings, if you really believe that there is one single solution to all human ills, and this solution you must impose at no matter what cost, you are likely to become a violent and despotic tyrant in the name of your solution, because your desire to remove all obstacles to it will end by destroying those creatures for whose benefit you offer the solution. The notion that there are many values, that they are incompatible, the whole notion of plurality, the whole notion of inexhaustibility, the whole notion of the, so to speak, in some sense, imperfection of all human answers and arrangements, the notion that no single answer which claims to be perfect and true, whether in art or in life, can in principle be perfect or true. That, I think, we certainly owe to the Romantics. And so, a rather peculiar situation has arisen. Here are the Romantics whose chief burden is to destroy ordinary tolerant life, to destroy philistinism, to destroy common sense, to destroy peaceful avocations of men, to raise everybody to some passionate level of self-expressive experience of such a kind as perhaps only divinities in the older works of man were supposed to exercise. This is the ostensible sermon, the ostensible purpose of Romanticism, whether among the Germans of whom I speak, or in Bayern, or among the French, or whoever it may be. And yet, as a result of making clear the existence of plurality of values, by the result of driving wedges into the notion of the classical ideal, of the single answer to all questions, of the rationalizability of everything, of the answerability of all questions, of the whole jigsaw puzzle conception of life. By doing this, they have, as it were, put forward prominently and laid emphasis upon the incompatibility of human ideals. And if these ideals are incompatible, then human beings sooner or later realize that they must make do, they must make compromises, because if they seek to destroy others, others will seek to destroy them. With the result that as a result of this passionate, fanatical, half-mad doctrine, we have appreciation of the necessity of tolerating others, the necessity of preserving an imperfect equilibrium in human affairs, the impossibility of driving human beings so far into the pen which we have created for them, or into the single solution which possesses us, that they will ultimately revolt against us, or at any rate be crushed by it. So the result of Romanticism is liberalism, toleration, decency, and the appreciation of the imperfections of life. Some degree of increased, if you like, rational self-understanding. This certainly was very, very far from the intentions of Romanticism. But at the same time, so far as Romantic doctrine is true, they are the persons who most strongly emphasize the unpredictability of all human activities. And in their own particular case, they are hoisted their own petard. Aiming at one thing, they produced, fortunately for us all, almost the exact opposite. Thank you very much. I'm most grateful to you for having had the patience to listen to these 6 long lectures.